Yeah.
Okay, everybody. Thanks again for being here for a great day. And we saved some pretty awesome people for last, I got to tell you. So I'm really glad you could all join us for this panel. And without giving away too much, I'm going to turn it right over to Jeanne LeClaire from the Mass Life Science Center, and she's going to kick off our panel as our moderator.
Thank you so much, John. So I'm Jeanne LeClaire. I'm the Senior Director of Business Development and Workforce Partnerships with the Mass Life Sciences Center. I'm really glad to be here today. And I'm joined by three excellent panelists. We have Seeham. She's the Senior Manager of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and GMP Quality Assurance at Blueprint Medicines. And then to her left, we have Diana Cruz Solash. She's the Vice President of Talent, Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity at Vertex Pharmaceuticals. And then we have Ross Marshall, her very own from MassBio, Senior Director of the DEI Advisory at MassBio. So thank you all for joining us. So we thought we would kick it off today with a discussion of what, why, and how. So what do we mean when we say inclusion? What do we mean by DE&I? Just as a heads up in terms of defining our terminology, you're going to hear a lot of acronyms up here. DE&I, D&I, DEI, and B. There's no wrong acronym for the use of today, so just know that whatever fits with your company is fine with us. Questions welcome, though. So this is turning over to all three of you panelists. What do we mean when we say inclusion, retention, advancement, and DE&I in general? And how do we define success? How do we know when we've gotten there?
All right, I can go ahead and get started. When I think about inclusion, retention, and advancement, it really leads back to the conversation of when organizations oftentimes focus on recruiting diverse talent. And what I mean by diverse talent is historically underrepresented talent. So this is Black, Indigenous, people of color, inclusive of Latinx, East Asian, and South Asian. And so when you look at just recruiting these historically underrepresented populations, you also need to have a mechanism and a culture to retain them. And in order to retain them, you need to have possibilities for them to advance within your organization. Something I noticed when Joe was presenting is a lot of organizations seem to have this chasm between entry-level positions and these higher-level positions at director levels, VP, et cetera. Then there seems to be a gap of when you bring in talent, do you have mechanisms to teach them to be able to advance up the career ladder while they're within an organization, which is what would help them stay. So it isn't just a focus on recruiting, but what are you doing to keep people there?
Yeah, and I'll add to it. And first, thanks for having this discussion. I think we're going to have a very rich dialogue, and there's so much collective knowledge in the room. For Vertex Pharmaceuticals, a big piece, I won't necessarily go over the inclusion and diversity piece, but equity is super important. And when I think about equity and Vertex thinks about equity, it's about access. Access to opportunities, access to information, access to resources that really enable everyone to thrive. And similarly, we look at our data and say, okay, how do we measure that? Well, we can look at talent pipeline, and typically for our historically marginalized and underrepresented groups, the talent pipeline looks like, the pyramid where there's more representation at the bottom, less so at the top. For majority men, it looks like the total opposite. So it leads to a question of why. Why is that happening? So looking at what job assignments are we giving people? I loved the conversation about criteria. We did a job description scrub as Vertex because we're saying we're getting in our own way of what we're trying to achieve. So I think equity is a thing that we are really focused on.
I think everybody has a different definition for diversity, equity, and inclusion, what it means to them, what it means to their organizations. For me, I think of diversity as that belonging component of it, that we all look out there and we all want. The equity for me is the work, the initiatives that we put out there, the heavy lifting that we do as an organization, the outreach that we do. And the inclusion is measuring the equity part of it there. And without the measuring part of there, we don't have accountability, we can't set goals, and we just don't know where we are in the space. So that for me, it runs up to those three.
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely a wide spectrum of what this conversation will include. So we just wanted to start out by sort of defining terms and setting out sort of the boundaries of what this conversation and what these initiatives can look like. Moving a little bit to the why, we hear this sometimes. I'm sure you guys have heard it. If the goal is to include everyone, if inclusion is about making everyone feel welcome, why do we focus on specific groups sometimes differently?
I love this question because oftentimes it gets to whenever organizations do this work, there's, you start talking about systemic racism, white privilege. One of the initial things that comes up is like, well, people are going to be offended. The question is, who is going to be offended? Like the people who are going to be offended have sat in this place of privilege where you haven't had to face the realities of systemic racism. You haven't had oppressive, intentional means that have kept you at the bottom of the ladder. So when we talk about inclusion, it's actually an inclusion with a caveat of inclusion as long as you are not diminishing anyone else in the room. And I particularly mean historically marginalized populations. So when we talk about inclusion within an organization, it really has to take into account that there are systemic oppressions that don't just exist outside of organizational walls, it also exists within your organizations, and oftentimes it shows up in very subtle ways, which is why when you talk about inclusion, it needs to start with the most oppressed people within our communities and even within your employee population.
Yeah, and I always love the way that Riz talks about this work. We had the pleasure of being on a panel last year, so love listening to you. When I love that question too. It's like inclusion is about everybody, so why do we have differential efforts? And the way that I, having done this work for many years, I think I've finally come up with something that sort of gets people to pause, which is if we think about markets that we're in, if we're underperforming in a market, by every metric we hold dear, whether it's retention, headcount, pull-through and pipeline, engagement, do we blame the market and say, oh, it's the market's fault? Or do we go in and say, you know what, we've got to do something differently? And then that has, I have found, helped people to pause and say, oh, okay, I get it now. And I love, I think I sent this out as a resource. There's a great article about equity in our work from the Stanford. Did I send it to you? I think I did. That talks about targeted universalism. And I really like this concept of saying, we can do things that are universally good for everybody. So if you think about women as an example and flexible work arrangements and women really pushing that forward, that actually benefits everybody. So targeted universalism, thinking about what will benefit everybody, but particularly historically marginalized groups, is also another way to think about that question.
I would also say that diversity is a spectrum. And for every organization, those needs and that growth comes up differently. So it's important to measure where we are as an organization to find out what diversity we have in-house. And that way we can make our efforts count as we move forward to try to increase diversity and representation within our ranks.
Yeah, definitely. So leading kind of from that now into the how do we get there? Are there specific examples? Are there methods, recommendations, best practices, initiatives that perhaps you've been involved in directly or know about that you could share in sort of a guiding North Star sort of way, should anyone be thinking about trying to replicate this?
Sure. I'll start with a question you asked at the beginning. So how do you measure success within this space? Because if you start with that end goal in mind, then you can kind of come back and look at the initiatives that you need to do to be able to get there. So I feel like within the ED&I space or DEI space, however you would like to phrase it, there's an objective measure and then there's a subjective measure. So the objective measure is when you look at your company's statistics, your organizational numbers, composition, promotion rates, et cetera. And then there's a subjective measure that particularly gets at lived experiences. So what is the narratives and experiences of your historically marginalized employees, folks within your organization? Do they feel like the black and brown folks within your organization, do they feel like they're being heard, that they're being given equitable opportunities to advance, that they have psychological safety? And when you put those two when you put those the measurements together, that's when you have this complete picture of where you want to go with ED&I. And so at Blueprint Medicines, and my people are sitting right there, so I look at them. The way that we've tried to approach this is we want to dive into the discomfort. So shortly after George Floyd's murder, we initiated our ED&I committee, and we dove into the deep end of, we want to talk about white privilege and systemic racism. Everybody in this room is going to get uncomfortable. We're going to sit here for 45 minutes if that's what it takes, but we're going to do it because the conversation has been left out for far too long, and that the people who have continually been oppressed continue to be at the bottom without anybody hearing their voice, and that is just unacceptable. So having uncomfortable conversations is a big piece of this. And then the second is, as you look at your structural and your policies, ED&I isn't this thing that you do. It's actually how you do everything. So when you look at your organization, how are you recruiting? How are you advancing? How are you looking at your statistics? Are they driven up by gender and race, or are you just looking at overall company demographics and you're like, you know what, we're actually doing great against our state population? That's not enough. So you have to look at the how. I'm gonna pause there because she has so many great things to say.
So I guess if we start with the end in mind, and we use a maturity model that we talk about the typical path that companies progress along in their journey for ID&E excellence, and typically it starts with a compliance focus. So how do I stay out of trouble, right? You see anti-harassment, anti-discrimination training, and that is absolutely necessary, but is not sufficient. And then the next stage is usually around programmatic. And this is where you see a lot of grassroots efforts. So employee resource networks, you might see training on unconscious bias, but they're very event driven, and they don't really get at what Riz was talking about, which is how you do everything. People go to these things, they feel great, they go back to the same environment. Where we are as Vertex is really, making this about being leader-led, and infusing ID&E in our processes, because that's when you really scale inclusion, diversity, and equity and go from a moment to a movement. And so our strategy is really built around how do we scale ID&E, because it lives in interactions and decisions that happen on the ground every day. So we've got a 3-part strategy that is first equipping all Vertexians with the skills, the resources, the tools to activate ID&E. So that's a lot of work with leadership teams. It's our what we call our live ID&E curriculum. The second is really about embedding ID&E in all our core processes. So we have a really tight partnership with talent acquisition. I actually have performance management, succession planning, and talent reviews all under my shop, which I love, because then I can just talk to myself and say, not just myself, but I can say to my team, hey, this is how we're going to do this work. And it just, gets infused in. And then the last is really to differentially invest where we have gaps in representation, and do that unapologetically for the reasons that we described. And I'm happy to talk more about any particular initiatives as people might like.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to having an equitable framework. And when I say that, it's like, would you start your business, would you run your business without a budget? Of course not. It doesn't make sense. Well, how can you run your business, start your business, without having an equitable framework in mind? It has to be inculcated in the foundation of your organizations to really benefit from having a diverse population in your workforce.
Yeah, and we've talked a little bit about this and come at it from a couple different angles, but because of the workforce struggles that so many companies are seeing across the country, across industries, but particularly life sciences as well, many companies, I'm finding in just my business development work, are suddenly all ears when it comes to stuff like this. And whereas maybe a few years ago there wasn't quite the momentum for it, and now out of necessity, these companies are suddenly really interested in what we can do better. Somewhat more on a recruitment perspective and less on a taking care of the employees they already have. I'd love to hear, I guess, a little bit in maybe ways that you've seen that balance play out, ways that companies can kind of take care of who they've got and maybe also achieve some of those recruitment goals when it comes to DE&I, and where that balance kind of lies.
That's a great question. Also probably very loaded because there's so many ways that you could tackle this. I was I don't know who I was talking to about this, but I feel like when you look at recruitment, one of the ways in which you can tackle both the culture piece, which really which really keeps your people there, and bring in more representative talent, is the representation needs to span across all the levels. Like how Diana was just talking about, it's a pyramid. You can't just have this wide representation of folks like sitting within a manager to an associate director level, and then from director level all the way to your executive team, you have one Black person, and that's like what you call your diversity. Like that's called tokenization, that's called checking the box, and it does not, and the people see right through it, particularly historically marginalized folks see right through that. So what you really need to do is, as you start to look at this, the how, what I was talking about in the ED&I's how you do it, your recruitment needs to span across from top to bottom, because what happens then is people will be attracted to your organization because they see themselves in your leaders. They see a pathway, they see advocates that they can relate to. And that's super important in not only like how you're bringing in talent, but also how you're planning on keeping them there. It's going to change your culture, because then you'll have multiple lived experiences around a table, adding to your structures, your policies.
Yeah, I agree with that. And maybe one of the things that I'll talk about, because one of our goals that we have, just to talk turkey, because everybody likes to know, like, really, what are your goals and what are your metrics? One of ours is to close the gap where it exists between representation at the director and above level and the overall workforce, because we don't want to just recruit our way out of the issue at the lower levels. And I was really pleased that we were able to set that as a goal, because you can pull many levers. There's recruiting, there's promotion, there's retention. And one of the things that we started last year was something called executive mentoring circles, to really get people proximate. So our executive committee is all last year, and we just rolled out the second cohort. They're mentoring 3 or 4 self-identified Black and Latinx directors through VPs, meeting once a month for 6 months for an hour each, and then meeting one-on-one with these individuals at least twice. And it was so fantastic to hear our executive committee members. They were a little competitive. They're like, I met with mine, and here's what I'm doing, which is always fun. And more importantly, I was connecting with the mentees and saying, how's the experience? What have you gotten out of that? And people were, saying, I was able to call up this executive committee member as I was thinking about 2 different internal opportunities, and he spent an hour with me working that through. And so now we're closing that distance that often exists when you don't have the relationship, so that people are talking about this talent in a very different way. This individual who I also mentioned was also sharing with me that she got to recruit for her own team. She moved into a particular role, and she's an MSL, and she was recruiting for her own team. And she said that all the people asked her, all the candidates, whether they were from underrepresented communities or not, asked, what are you doing around diversity? And she said, Diana, I had literally welled up with tears, because I could actually say, here's something that I experienced that was so meaningful for my career. So I just say that to say it's a virtuous cycle of focusing on your people will help the recruiting and help us achieve our goals.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing that in the way of talent acquisition there. And of course, everybody wants to talk about how do we get more talent in the door there. We really need to take the steps back and think about what our culture has to offer these recruits, these new people into our ecosystem there. Because if we don't have a system of belonging there, those initiatives in place, that comes from leadership. We need leadership that can recognize that there are, these systems out there that are inequitable. They need to also recognize their own privilege and how they can create opportunities within their organizations there. And when we have this kind of system put in place there, then we'll start seeing some real turnaround there with not only talent acquisition, but people staying. And I've been in organizations where we put a lot of effort into getting talent in the door, but they don't stay. And then they just throw their hand up and say it doesn't work. But they have to take a look inside here. And I'm saying we've been seeing numbers all day here, and it can be a tough pill to swallow, because we created this system that we're at now. So how do we turn it around? And that's the real hard work that we're doing here today. So.
Yeah.
Can I make a quick comment? I was just reminded of how I know a lot of organizations use referral programs, and this can work against you in many ways. So for instance, at Blueprint, one of the things we've taken a look at is when your company composition is predominantly a certain race or gender, like will beget like. So your referral program is going to tend to bring in that same demographic. But as you start to become more representative, it's going to work in your favor. So we have a certain department, our regulatory department for that matter, has been a huge case study for, as we've brought in more diversified talent, it is arguably the most representative group that we have at Blueprint. They have the most amount of Black and brown folks who not only sit within entry-level roles, but across the board all the way to senior director and VP. And so it really goes to show that as you start to focus on the belonging, and then as you focus on this like leadership structure of how do you mentor from within and bring people up, it's going to create the cycle that's going to start feeding diversity and representation for business continuity. Like you really need to plan for like 5, 10, 20-year range of how is your business going to continue to do this well beyond your years.
Definitely. Thank you for adding that. And to the panel's credit, all of them wanted to make sure that we left as much time as possible for questions and conversation. So please be thinking about that. We have just a couple more for you guys. What resources, what do you guys read? What should folks look at when they're thinking about learning more about this, or again, thinking about putting into practice some of the ideas you've shared? Any great recommendations for resources to follow up? And I know that we'll be sending them out to all of you through John. Go ahead.
I love the Deloitte model because Diana had suggested it to me. We actually use it at Blueprint to kind of pick out our North Star as well. It's where the Deloitte model, for those of you, I know we're going to send it out, it was actually created back in 2018. But the course of like the 4-level structure that it goes over of how an organization can mature through ED&I, they call it D&I, add in the equity because that's very key. That's super helpful. The other thing is in terms of education, everyone has access to Google. Like I talk to the Blue Crew, we call Blueprint members Blue Crew, like talk to them all the time about self-education. Can be something as little as go on TED Talk, find a topic and like listen to one once a week. It is maybe 10, 15 minutes of your time. It works to just like whatever will help you expand your scope. Try to live in somebody else's shoes. Like have a conversation with your coworker about what you learned in that TED Talk and these ways of trying to counteract your own unconscious biases, because every single one of us has them. It's so key. Like you don't need a formal training and that being like the stagnant one-time thing. Every organization is going to do this. It becomes a very performative thing. And it's like, it irks me when that happens. Cause like, what is your continuation? Like, how are your people pulling this through? And how are you going to interact with this on a day-to-day basis? Does somebody in a room know that when they walk in and say, hey guys, not everybody responds to guys? Like, are you like aware of those kinds of unconscious biases that just like play out immediately? Those are the things that you're going to gain once you start to self-educate and train your muscles to like become stronger in, I'm going to watch what I say right now. What is the intent of what I'm about to say? And what is the impact of what I'm about to say? Like, let me take a minute to like pause before I blurt this out.
I've heard myself say guys 2 times.
Everybody does it. Everybody does it.
So thank you.
I've had to train a lot.
I saw
Heard.
But I mean, you have to be able to call people in with grace too, right? I mean, I might be an ID&E leader, but I make mistakes all the time, and my kids always tell me when I do. So one of the resources I like is bias interrupters. I had the privilege when I was at Ernst & Young of sitting on that committee. Professor Joan Williams out of UC Hastings Law started this website, and it's super practical because it's all talking about what are the interventions, like what are the watch outs in various processes, like talent processes, whether that's hiring, assigning work, promotions, performance management, what are the watch outs? And then what are the ways you can interrupt that and build that into the moment? Because self-education and individual action is absolutely necessary. And I also think we can use our processes and systems to nudge us towards inclusion and equity without, someone having to think about it. The other reason I bring it up is that people often say, oh, I don't work for a big biotech, right? I work for a small company. And how do I get the resources and the time to do this? If you look at bias interrupters, a lot of these things are just building things into the processes you're already running.
If you're a MassBio member, the greatest resources is the DEI team. Warner Santiago and myself make ourselves readily available to talk to our members every day about how to aid them along their DEI journey. And if you're not a member, please take advantage of our resources we have on the website there. We have a lot of inclusive guides there that help your organizations. I think they're the two biggest ones we have.
Perfect. Thank you all. We would love to move now to some questions. We had an idea sort of collectively to kick it off. Actually, I think Riz, this came from you. If some of these ideas, some of this conversation feels really new to you, or if some of these initiatives are not things that are happening at your current organization or company, we'd be interested to hear why it feels like that is, if there are barriers, if there are challenges in place, if there's just structurally not an appetite for it. What are sort of the pain points and the pinch points when it comes to trying to enact some of these in your own experience? Other than that, though, we're happy to take any other questions or comments, of course. Yeah, go ahead.
So talking about working for a small company, we have a small company. Our entire exec team actually is women, but it's white women. And, I hear a lot when I'm interviewing people, younger white women, they're like, oh, what's it like to work for a woman-run company? And they're all excited and they can see themselves growing into those roles. But, I don't see our leadership team leaving anytime soon. How do we diversify our employees if, there aren't the roles to hire all of the different levels? And how do we make people feel like they do have a path still there?
Go for it.
I think that's a real question. I mean, that is absolutely one of the things. It's like, oh gosh, how do we do that? I guess what I might suggest, and I don't know your organization, so I'll just share, because that's true of many companies. The board's not going to move on. The executive committee's not going to move on. What are the other roles that are high visibility, high profile roles? So who are, in our world at Vertex, who are the disease area experts who run a program? Who gets to be on that disease strategy team from every, function? And those are prime roles, highly visible. So I might think of those kinds of roles.
And then I would love to understand, in having a majority white female board or executive team, how do they feel about their allyship? And, do they understand how to be proper allies in this space to create that psychological safety for a more representative workforce, even if they may not be at their level?
They want to. I think that one of the things we've been discussing is that they want it to be perfect. They want to roll out programs that, are going to be perfect for everybody, and they're getting their own way because they don't want to pull the trigger and accidentally affect somebody. And so that's kind of where we're stuck right now.
Oh my God, I would love to talk to your people. Because the thing is so what we love to say at Blueprint is we like to do things scrappy. So when we started our ED&I initiatives, we did not have a North Star. I feel like I got a lot of my ideas from Diana, as we were going. We knew we had a first step, and that's all we needed to know that there was a staircase. We're going to take it one step at a time. If they can just get on board with, can you just take a first step with a great amount of faith in that you're doing the right thing? If your end goal is to bring in a more representative group, you waiting to make things perfect will be waiting forever, because there is no such thing. There's no company out there that's done ED&I perfectly. If there were, we would have a model. All of us would be rolling out. We wouldn't be here today. But that's not true. So if they can understand that you don't have any positions open in which you can hire diverse or representative folks, become allies in this space. How can you be the voice, use your white privilege, which whenever I use that term, I actually mean that as a opportunity for someone where you have innate power that I do not, because I show up in a different form. And now you have this opportunity to use that power to elevate somebody else who has been historically marginalized, to give them an opportunity in your company, to help them feel seen, to mentor them, like Diana was saying, so that even if they don't get the position at your company, they can do it somewhere else. And that would be a success for you. And then in addition to that, creating this culture of being able to openly talk about the fact that, hey, yes, we do have a lot of gender diversity, but we're kind of sucking on the racial front right now. That's okay. We're going to work on it, and here's how. That's going to make them an active ally in this space, as opposed to this performative piece of when companies try to wait to have the perfect program. That's like climbing a mountain that has no summit. You're going to burn out very quickly.
And I think you said it previously that it's supposed to be uncomfortable. Like, that's okay. That's how it starts. And so I think that feeling of being so afraid to engage with something because you're afraid to make a single mistake is exactly what sort of hampers that from moving forward. So the self-education piece, the idea of creating space for those conversations is a big step in that direction so that no one feels like they're out there alone trying to get it all right the first time. Absolutely.
I would also draw like a comparison, right, of when you talk about like who's going to get offended. Compare the offense that somebody is going to feel as a result of doing this work in comparison to the people who have sat in this layer of discomfort for generations on end and they do not see an end in sight. The latter weighs more always. And so you need to be able to draw that differentiation of like, if you're doing this work, it is going to be uncomfortable. If it's not uncomfortable, I'd argue you're not doing it right. Because it's just, we haven't done it and it's been far too long and you can't wait for the next George Floyd murder, the next like big call for this to happen, because this is continual. Like you can't wait for that trigger. And actually, poor choice of words, I'm not going to use that, but it's just like you can't wait for those kinds of signals to come around to understand that you need to make changes now, even if it means that you don't see that whole staircase.
Thank you. Other questions or stories or input? Yes, I see in the second row.
Hi, everybody. I'm Denisha from Prometrica. I love how you guys are talking about, it's necessary to have these uncomfortable conversations, and I totally agree. My question is, do you have any suggestions on how to get an employee force to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and to get them in a place where they're okay with having these uncomfortable conversations?
I think your bias interrupters are solid for this.
The bias. So, thanks.
They're prompts.
PSA.
I mean, I think first there's got to be trust, right? So, I think that starting personally. I'm going to say this, and it doesn't work in all cases, but like one thing that we have found to be helpful. So there are two things. One is we have the social identities wheel. That at a social identities toolkit that we've have self-serve teams can talk about social identities and talk about what that means in terms of how they show up and how they show up with what identity first when and it becomes really personal. So it helps to make it about like here's my before there's an issue or something that's uncomfortable, you're having the conversation about what is most meaningful to me? What does this identity mean to me in my interactions? The other thing that we have is our baseline training for our live curriculum is insider and outsider dynamics. And we have groups share, like, when did I feel like an insider? What was it? When did I feel like an outsider? And that gives people more perspectives and appreciation. And then we lead up to, then if you see something, how do you call someone in? And we actually have a Zoom background that we use, which is like a little bit of a stoplight that says red if you hear something that you think is coded. Now we're talking about in the context of interview debriefs and talent calibrations. If you hear something that sounds like coded language, like stop. And then the yellow is like ask a question. What did you mean by that? Tell me more about that, because then asking a question gets somebody to articulate what did I mean by that? I don't know what I meant by that. And so it's not like a quick thing, but I think that building trust, getting people personal before there are those uncomfortable moments helps to build, some muscle memory for that.
I can tell you about one of the things that we did at Blueprint to kind of build trust, because psychological safety is really the basis for this, is we call them ED&I circles. So we started them around shortly after George Floyd's murder, where this ED&I circle is really an open forum conversation. So we pick a topic every 6 weeks. You have 3 different sessions. We provide pre-reads ahead of each session. So for example, one of the first conversations was around systemic oppression. We talked about critical race theory. We're talking about the anti-LGBTQIA laws in next week. And ahead of each session, we send 5 pre-reads. A couple of them are videos, a couple of them are audio, a couple of them are articles. We ask, it's open to the whole company. You show up to the conversation. We have a moderator, and you start the conversation by laying out some ground rules of We're not here to win a battle. You're not here to dominate an argument. You're here to hear perspectives and open yourself up to the idea that you may not know something because of your lived experience. And in the beginning, it was super uncomfortable because you're talking about systemic racism in a company where we were majority white folks. And you had a couple of people of color in the room who didn't feel like very comfortable expressing their lived experience because nobody else could relate. And so, but over time, we've realized that people have started to humble themselves to the fact that there are things that they have never experienced in their life, and because of their lived experiences and their unconscious biases that they're surrounded by always, even at like this later age of being in your 40s and 50s or wherever, you are starting to relearn, like unlearn things and relearn. And it is a muscle you have to flex. And this is where I came up with the thing, we call it a reflective silence. It's not awkward silence anymore, because when you're sitting in these conversations, you're gonna have some of that. And my go-to thing is like, we're gonna sit here for the next 45 minutes if you want to in reflective silence, or one of you can say something, we can start somewhere. And it really helps people to get going of like, say whatever, say the wrong thing so that you're saying it in this forum as opposed to saying it somewhere else where nobody's going to feel comfortable correcting you. And we're a company of like 500 something now. And so like it worked to try to get like 20 something people together at a time and like have these conversations on repeat.
I don't really have much to add to both of those comments there, except that I think it also may be a generational thing where I was growing up where you don't talk about religion, politics, or money, especially at business or at the dinner room table. But I think the new generation coming into the workforce is much more comfortable talking about these things. They're sharing their salaries, they're talking about race, they're bringing up these subjects that have always been traditionally taboo. And if we don't get ourselves in that space to have those conversations, then they're going to bypass us. So it's taking these techniques that these women brought up here, implementing it there, and yeah, people are going to be uncomfortable. We may be uncomfortable. We have to get over ourselves. You know, we may have to start out with a smaller contingency within that side of our organizations and build up coalition, but we have to start somewhere. And usually we have to start with ourselves.
Thank you for that question. I feel like this is going to be a really great list of resources to follow up with everyone about. So thank you. Other questions, comments, input, experiences? Yeah, go ahead. Right there, fourth row. There's a mic coming if you'd like. I can hear you.
Hi. So my name's Katie. I am the only HR person at a very early stage biotech company. So, you know, we're starting to think about DE&I and just really starting to have that conversation. I think one of the things that you mentioned that's so helpful is doing some benchmarking, basically getting a sense of the diversity within the company at present. My question is how to do that sensitively, especially knowing that people can have many different identities. And I like this idea of the what was it, the wheel, the social identities wheel? Yeah. So I guess that's my question is how do we do that sensitively? Because I do think it's so important in order for us to know where we want to go from where we are.
We give away so much information just to get free Wi-Fi. I don't understand why there's a hesitation to ask any question in HR regarding, you know, DEI. You know, we're used to giving that information out. And if we have trust in our organization to believe that, hey, we're doing this so we can make a better workplace, then I want to contribute to this because this is maybe the one of the few opportunities I have to really express how I feel about what's going on around me.
I do agree that we as HR should steward that. I might have a little bit of a different take because it's one of the dilemmas in ID&E. We have boxes. We have these fake, you know, constructs by which we identify, but they're fake, but they're real in terms of lived experiences. And you know, I'm always cautious to say, look, we have these ways of measuring. This isn't everything, but it is an indicator, and we're going to use it because we want to make the working environment better. And we can see that there are patterns. Does it capture every pattern of lived experience? No, it does not. And so we talk a lot about like an over-reliance on hard data, right? And lived experience is so important. So I would just maybe pair the like, hey, we're trying to build a better working world with this, you know, acknowledgement that the data will never capture every single lived experience. And we're going to pair that with understanding the lived experience too, but this will help us at a macro level. I was on a call a couple of weeks ago. We have this thing called the Idea Incubator. It's our ID&E Action Incubator. It's, people from around the organization who chair ID&E task forces where they're part of the business. And we were going over some data, and I was so happy that somebody called me in and said, Diana, you're talking about this data so glibly. She didn't use glibly, but that's kind of how I heard it. And let's not forget that there are stories behind every single number. And I was like, you know what? Thank you for sharing that, because you're right. I'm just sort of skating over it as if everybody understands that's the case. So I think you got to have that piece with it as well.
Is the hesitation on how are you defining race? Are you adding sexual orientation? Just trying to.
I think there's two levels of hesitation. So the first is,
So I think there are two levels of hesitation. I think the first is exactly that. What categories do we choose? I mean, even choosing Asian, for instance, is so ridiculous. So how do we start to get a little bit more granular, but maybe not get too granular? And then I get the sense of, we have a parent company, that there may also be some nervousness to have, that there could be any perception that we might use that data that we collect even inadvertently to discriminate. And so I think those are the two sensitivities.
Oh yeah, that's completely valid. I'm harping on when Diana just said that race is definitely a social construct. The way that we like to use it at Blueprint is you use the social construct to your advantage. So we follow the way that our HR forms are set up right now. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jen. Is we follow the same categories that are set up in, I believe, the census or government forms. Since folks are used to that, it is certainly not fully inclusive. That's the initial transparency and disclaimer around that. And speaking of that disclaimer, it is so important that your employees understand why you're asking for the information, because you're right, particularly historically marginalized folks where you may have a lack of trust with organizations and a lack of trust we talk about that within the biotech industry in general, and you've been kind of taken advantage of in the past and it's not been used in your favor. You need to be transparent around that. You're actually trying to use this to benefit your recruitment processes, your policies, your structures, because that layer of transparency creates trust with your employees. It builds that psychological safety for them to know that the data is being collected for this, and I now feel safe sharing this. They should also feel safe asking questions and also not choosing to identify. That is completely up to them if they want to do that. And then you would have maybe your sample population would be small in what you're presenting, but at least it would be honest in terms of how you've interacted with your population to get the data and how you would be using it.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, another one right next to you. Grab that mic. Yeah. Thank you. I think it's for the people listening remotely.
My name is Weezy Waldstein. I'm with a community-based coalition network called Action for Equity, and I am not representative of the people that I work with. I'm much whiter, much older. So I'm just putting a little bit of that context. I'm noticing, Riz, that you carry an operations title and an HR title. And so I have a two-part question. One is, how do you on the HR side interact with your operations people on these issues? And any advice on that, any of that? And the other is, does having an operations role give you more authority, or is it a complexity to what you're doing?
Oh man. Well, the first thing is the title's been updated. So I actually now sit as the Associate Director of Just ED&I at Blueprint. But I do. I have a quality regulatory background. Yes, absolutely. The first part of your question is, yes, it actually really helps, because the way that ED&I really started as a passion project for me. I'm an activist out of necessity. I'm biracial, Muslim immigrant, many different identities where I sit at this intersection of consistently being marginalized. And so it's such a privilege to be able to turn a passion into a career. So I was able to utilize a lot of the things that we were implementing to kind of use my quality team as my guinea pig of I'm going to try this out on y'all and let's see if it works out before we roll it out company wide. And you start to have conversations around how are we recruiting? Like, where are your referrals coming from? Like, who's being given promotional opportunities? How are you determining where opportunities are going? And even when I was reporting into a line of white men after white man after white man, so like, even flexing my inner courage of being able to go up to them and say like, hey, you're a white man. I know your unconscious bias is going to come out as soon as I say this, but I think I deserve a promotion. And then having that like very open conversation. I like to approach a lot of things at Blueprint of, I'm going to ask this question. I'm going to see if I'm going to get fired today. And I'm still hired. So like it's worked, but it helped me flex that courage of, let's try things that people may not necessarily have tried. Cause I think it's worth it to see if we need to find other ways to challenge the status quo. So now, like having that experience, I think it helped me move into this full-time role of understanding how is it that you can capitalize on a group of people to try to influence them to do the things that you're trying to do. And now moving that over to a much larger scale of like trying to influence 500 people and see like where that takes me. Stay tuned if I get fired at some point. You know.
Thank you for the question. Yep, front row. I see you back there next. Front row first.
Thank you. I'm Catherine from WPI. So I have a question. One of the marginalized communities are those with physical limitations or needing adjustments. And where and how are you seeing this population within your initiatives or in the DEI conversation? Because I don't hear this being brought up a lot.
I love that question. In fact, you know, and it's something that is on the roadmap for Vertex. And you know, it's just, if I could like get to everything at once, that like would certainly have been, but we are now exploring, particularly with our, you know, neurodivergent, and I heard a new term yesterday, neurodistinct. I'd never heard neurodistinct. And I was going to share that with one of my children who is neurodivergent. But we are thinking about, you know, gosh, there's a whole talent pool. There's many talent pools. This being one community that we haven't, you know, we haven't reached out to yet. So I can only say we're starting to think about like what are the roles where we have the business needs. You know, learning from it. So I used to work at Ernst & Young. Ernst & Young is like 8 years ahead of where, you know, Vertex is. And so I got on the phone with some of my colleagues, you know, former colleagues there to say, tell me about the journey, the roadmap, everything. So more to come. Not solved yet.
I also love this question. The way that we approach it is because we're a much smaller organization than Vertex, it's, you know, the way we deal with it is we have the series that we do called the Celebrating Diversity videos. So we had an individual who had epilepsy and wanted to kind of speak up about how neurodivergent and neurodistinct communities are often forgotten about in this conversation. And I have another comment I'd love to just make after this. But when she spoke up, like it was around, because she has epilepsy, we were in the Zoom environment. And whenever you got on a Zoom call, people were like, you know, turn on your camera. And like, why aren't you on camera? Stop asking that question, because not everybody's in a position to be able to, one, they don't have to explain themselves. Two, you can encourage it in the beginning of a dialogue. But it's things like that of having folks who sit in that position who are willing to speak up about like, what is your lived experience and what are the things that would help that if your coworkers did, it would make your life a little easier within the workplace, and like creating that awareness. Cause like Diana and Ross were saying, like knowledge is really the first part of it. And then the other comment I had is, oftentimes when we talk about ED&I and like race is brought up time and time again, the question comes up of like, you know, what about all these other communities? Race has a part that it plays in every single historically marginalized community. When you talk about the neurodivergent community, when you talk about the LGBTQIA+ community, people of color are treated differently and oftentimes very oppressively within each one of those communities as well. So it's really important to acknowledge that you can talk about these different communities and not saturate that, and ensure that within those communities you're also addressing the racial gaps that exist, because they're there. And even within the international scale, like that's also a consideration.
And our workforces already have accessibility people in it already that we don't even recognize. They could be neurodivergent, they could have accessibility accommodations that are taken on one-on-one that we just don't recognize because we don't see it. So they're already there. We need to do better jobs about supporting them though.
Thank you. And then in the back there.
I'm Cynthia Furman from UMass Chan Medical School. Something that universities are still working on is how to recognize through promotion or other methods the hidden contributions that individuals from underrepresented backgrounds make to the community through extra mentoring expectations or needs or requests, serving on varieties of committees, et cetera. And I'm sure that similar things happen in company settings. And I'm wondering, can you share any examples or strategies that you think might be helpful for universities or other companies that you've used to try to tackle this?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So we there are a couple of different ways. So one is that we have an internal talent marketplace. And through our internal talent marketplace, we have things called gigs. So these are, 5 to 10% of someone's time that they can, do something above and beyond their role that will build their skills in whatever way. So we have designated our employee resource network leadership roles as a gig so that it becomes formally recognized within their, performance management. I personally sent out notes to our employee resource network leaders and copied their managers to say, it's goal setting time. Please put this in your goals. I've also sent a note right before year end to say, okay, ask for feedback from your executive sponsors so that we can, shed a light on the things that are hidden through these formal processes.
I'm so sorry. Could you repeat the question? I feel like I zoned out for just a split second and then lost track.
It's about when you're someone, representing a group, right? So you're a person of color, woman of color in a department or at some part of your company, for example. And my experience is in university settings, right? You might be asked to serve on a number of different committees or have a lot of students who are also share a similar identity to you coming and requesting additional mentorship. So there might be kind of a larger tax on you, or you might just be seen as a strong mentor, right? Or whatever it is. But, for example, at universities, faculty are often promoted or, given leadership experiences or whatever it is, often based on, the research productivity, right? Or the leadership opportunities they are given in these spaces aren't, rewarded or recognized the same way as leadership opportunities that might, help the bottom line more directly with research productivity, for example. Yeah. So I was curious about how companies are tackling this.
So I feel like you're going to run into this issue because oftentimes there's a lack of representation, and you're right, like people of color particularly, I think are taxed at, lead the ERG, be the ED&I face, et cetera. And first and foremost, it's really it's not a person of color's responsibility to do those things. I think having formal programs in place, like Diana was just talking about, are very helpful. So at Blueprint, we have a mentorship program where you have, and this doesn't have to work in a single direction, but it's rather voluntary for any Blue Crew member to sign up of which part of the business, which life skill, are you looking to learn? And then the coordinators of that program will pair you up with individuals who do have that set of skill that you're looking to attain. And so this way you're working from a wider pool of mentors. Perhaps they may not have the representation now, but at least it'll be one form of trying to attain that skill set. And there's also the other side of, sometimes people of color do seek out other folks of color because you see yourselves in them. And that part, it's a multifaceted solution of one in how you're recruiting, and this is why it's so important to have representation at those leadership levels. But two, if that individual is able and willing, it's their choice. Are you asking them before you kind of assign it to them? And two is, if they're doing it, it needs to go into as a part of their monetary compensation. It needs to go in that they have gone above and beyond, like Diana's saying, of their day-to-day role, and there needs to be monetary compensation to that. It can't be this, oh, you're doing a volunteer activity. We're not in high school. You're providing a service. You need to have a monetary compensation that accompanies that. Also, can I just say something? You said Chan UMass Medical School. Speaking of disability awareness, we partner with Work Without Limits at UMass Medical School. So they provide an excellent disability etiquette training where you're taught about how do you act around people who may have physical handicaps, mental handicaps, et cetera. And so it's excellent to just learn things like For instance, if you see an individual in a wheelchair, don't just assume that they want the door to be opened. It's a etiquette to ask whether or not they would like help. So that's another resource. Like if you're looking to educate, that's a great place to go.
The only thing I would add to that is that if you're a person from an unrepresented group in the workforce there, and these opportunities are coming knocking at your door, it's okay to have boundaries. It's okay to say, no, I can't take this on right now. And it's okay to say, hey, I am not a diversity expert. You may want to go out there and find a consultancy or bring somebody in-house that has that expertise to bring to the table. So it's also that emotional protection of yourself as well. So don't feel like you have to take on that extra job or initiative because you're the only person there.
You can direct them over to MassBio at Ross and Warner.
Please.
Perfect. We have time for maybe one more. If anyone's got questions, experiences, input, comment. Yep, go for it. Front row, Elizabeth. Yeah, I see. Well, we got time for two. It's fine. Go ahead. There's dessert after this at 3, so
And I don't want to hold people up. from
no
that.
worries. No, this is worth it.
Well, thank you. This has been a great panel, not just because Jeanne has been moderating, who is my colleague. I'm Elizabeth Kennedy. I'm at the Mass Life Sciences Center. So my question is really small companies, because Jeanne and I work with some companies where there's one person, right? We heard a little bit about people who are working at companies and they're trying to figure out their DE&I programs. Some of them are too small for MassBio. So I think we've been talking about a lot of great examples of companies like Vertex who are doing these really incredible things. And so I don't want to bring us down to the most basic level, but I did want to ask at the most basic level for companies that maybe don't have, sexual harassment policies sometimes, which we know affects young women of color predominantly. What should the most basic things that these companies that we interact with sometimes that are just a few employees, what would I know there are a number of different things they should, but what are like maybe some must-haves? Thank you so much.
Yeah, go for it.
I love the fact that when working in small startups or really small organizations is to have your own personal diversity statement. It inspired me to create my own. I have 3 pillars to it. I use data to make informed decisions, create equitable frameworks, and create economic opportunities within communities. And that could be supply diversity and other initiatives there. But if that meeting doesn't address one of those 3 pillars, I'm not in that meeting. I'm not getting out of bed to go to do anything if it doesn't hit at least one of those 3 pillars there. And I think an organization at any level can benefit from that.
I think where my head goes is like, think about what are the guiding principles and norms you want to set out, right? Because these are small companies, knock on wood that they'll grow. But how is it that the team, when there is a team, not just one person, or even that person, how spend some time thinking about what are the ways in which we're going to make decisions? What's always going to be true when we make a decision, that we have a diverse group around the table, that we are going to pause each other and stop if we, hear a personal bias come up. I mean, I think because that can apply to hiring, that can apply to talent decisions, even where you're investing, right? So that's where my head goes.
I completely agree. I was just going to say that you're in an optimal position because you're so small to just ingrain the how. Like ED&I isn't going to be a what for you. It's actually going to be how you're going to do everything. And so in your core values, the stuff that every company has splattered up on a wall, how is that inclusive and equitable to like the workforce that you're going to develop in the future? So spot on.
Thank you. And take us home there in the 3rd row. I think blueprint, team blue.
Thank you. I had a few questions, so I got to pick one. Okay. So maybe since this is the last question to take us home, I'd love to hear from each of you, what is something that really gets you out of bed? What's something that keeps you inspired? This is hard work. This is a long journey. Sometimes you might take 10 steps back to take 1 step forward. So just curious if you have some stories of kind of inspiration that keep you going and keep you motivated to stay in the space.
For me, it's really that like we're doing the work that we may not see the end results of this in our lifetime. We likely won't, but that future generations, like as I think about, like I'm gonna have brown kids one day, and like they're gonna grow up in this world where I want them to have a better chance of facing equity than I did. And like that is amazing that like we get to have a career in which you get to drive towards that every freaking day. Like how amazing is that? Because it didn't exist like when I was younger. And I'm also an immigrant, and when I came here, like the narrative was like put your head down and like just, you know, do the job. You have a single lane, get to retirement, that's the end goal. But like now to have this ability to influence how you're going to be treated as a person of color, how you're going to build systems that are going to be more equitable, and like everyone's going to have a voice at the table and they're going to be heard. Like that's pretty phenomenal to like live in a day and age where irrespective of all the things that are wrong, like that's going right.
Yeah, I guess I think about it to your question, like one story at a time. Like what are the stories that I hear? And there are two kinds of stories that really, like when that happens, I'm like, okay, I'm leaving the office because the day can't get any better. They're either the stories like I told earlier where, you know, this colleague of mine said, I genuinely could answer the question what we're doing around diversity. And I could feel, I mean, like it just, I was like, oh, I'm right there with you. And we're both like, you know, like welling, like really, because it's just like, it's the stuff of life, right? This is like this is the thing. And then the other thing that gets me is on the flip side, having leaders who thought they knew everything, right? Because we got a lot of smart people at these companies who are pretty sure they are like know everything. When they, you know, and I can think of a particular leader who, but no, but seriously, who like, you know, has opened himself up to feedback and said, you know, thank you. You've given me a different way of thinking. I'm like, that's amazing because that will go out and multiply. I have to hold on to those moments because it is really hard work, but those are the moments.
I would reflect on being a recent transplant in New England, coming up here in September from New York City, where everybody works in silos because it's just so big. I've been impressed about how it's been easy to connect with purpose-driven people and organizations here. Like we are in these rooms trying to make a game plan, decisions to increase equity and inclusion in the life sciences here. It's something, a community where you can get your hands around, and I really feel like we're going to get a lot of great stuff done in a very short period of time.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Thank you all for participating. Thank you. It's been my pleasure to moderate, and thank you to our excellent panelists, Riz Seeham, Diana Cruz, Solash, and Roz Marshall. We will see you all for dessert in the annex immediately after this. Thank you again, and thank you to the panelists.
Thank you.